And that's the stage where we rise above our fears, where we're no longer just facing our fears and acknowledging them, but we're looking at fear as a signal to us on how and when we have an opportunity to grow. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Flow Over Fear podcast, where it is our mission to help you to rise above fear and realize your ultimate potential in leadership and life. I'm your host, Adam Hill, and it is my goal to share with you the human side of high performance. My guests share their experience with fear, anxiety, struggle, challenge, and most importantly, despite all of it, how they rose above it to achieve incredible results. So, if you're ready to rise up, let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to this Flow Over Fear training session where I'm going to talk about three things. And those three things I'm going to talk about today are the three fear archetypes. That's right, there are three fear archetypes. And when we experience fear, we tend to experience it in different ways depending on how we face it. The first way we tend to experience fear is we fight it or we flee from it, right? There's fight or flight or freeze. And that's our typical response to it. That's our basal instinct is to fight, flee, or freeze when we experience it. And this is the archetype of the victim. And I have experienced this one, of course, when I was still in my drinking, when I was experiencing severe panic attacks and severe anxiety. A lot of times what I would do to fight that fear would be to suppress it by drinking. And it was definitely not a healthy way to address it. But a lot of times this is how we deal with fear. We suppress it. We push it down. We use substances. We use food. We starve ourselves. We do things that are not healthy. But in the immediate term, they resolve that sense of fear that we have, or they suppress it. And it feels like we're doing something away with it. We feel validated when we do that. When we're playing the victim, we tend to feel validated. And I know that when I say that this fear archetype is a victim, and I use victim as kind of a negative thing, this may hit people the wrong way. And I understand that. But the chances are, if you feel like you're a victim, chances are that's wise because you're experiencing fear in that negative way. And being a victim really is a choice. So we can choose to either be in that victim state or we could choose to rise above it. And which gets us to where the second fear archetype comes into play. That first one being the victim, where we're experiencing it as fleeing or fighting it. We're constantly, battling against it. We're constantly beating our heads against our wall. It's never a pleasant experience. And chances are that when we are using substances to help suppress that, or leaning into the victim mentality, we're even at that point, even though it's an immediate gratification, we're extending the pain for ourselves. But the way to get out of that is to rise up to face the fear. And this is the common, vernacular that we use around this is we talk about facing the fears, facing our fears. And I would say that that's the point at which we rise up from being that victim to being a soldier. And a soldier you may think of as somebody who's a fighter. And yes, they fight when they have to, but ultimately the role of a soldier is to be a peacekeeper. And that role of a soldier is to find peace and harmony in a conflict kind of situation, right? So when we rise up to face it, what we're trying to do with fear at that point, with our fears, is we're trying to acknowledge it. We're trying to acknowledge it, that it's there, that it exists in our world, and that it is part of who we are. And we're trying to accept it as part of who we are. And then we ask what it's trying to tell us, and to live with it, to acknowledge where we are afraid, and to really look at the things that are within or outside of our control. Now, when I relate this to my life, when I got sober, I went through a 4th step inventory through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's not promoting it per se, but it's what I'm just sharing my experience with getting sober as a way to rise up to face my fears. For many, many years, I had been fighting my fears and running from them by drinking to suppress the fear and the anxiety. But when my sponsor one day threw a piece of paper in front of me that had the big bold letters on the top of it that said fears, he wanted me to write down what I was afraid of as a fourth step inventory, to get real with myself, to identify my defects of character, to identify what I was so afraid of and who I had harmed in the process of being afraid, and how that had affected my world because I was afraid. It was getting real and really acknowledging that. Instead of just seeing this fear and just fighting it, I rose up to face it and say, what are you? Let's name you, and let's acknowledge you for what you are, and let's bring you into it as part of me. And through that process of facing it, I could live with the fear. I could live with the fear, and I could no longer let it dominate my life, just by simply putting names to it, by simply acknowledging what it was, and by looking at how it had harmed me in my life, and just realizing that it's part of the human experience to be afraid. And I went on living like that for, quite a while, which is not, is certainly not a bad thing. It's better to live in a world where we're facing our fears and we're acknowledging them, and we're admitting what's inside and outside of our control, and we're accepting it. But it's not the ideal life, because the ideal life is even one step above the soldier, which is we rise up to the hero archetype with fear. And that's the stage where we rise above our fears, where we're no longer just facing our fears and acknowledging them, but we're looking at fear as a signal to us on how and when we have an opportunity to grow. Now, if you think of a fear that you might have had in your life, where has fear challenged you to the point where it has been something that you've been afraid of, that you've wanted to run away from, that you wanted to fight, that you wanted to get angry at? And then where has been that situation where you faced it, where you've acknowledged it and you've said, this is a part of who I am. I'm not going to let it dominate my life, but I'm going to put a name to it, and I'm going to acknowledge it as part of the human experience, and I'm going to allow myself to feel it, but it's not going to dominate my life. And then, have you ever faced that time, or when you look at that situation, can you think of how it might be an opportunity to grow if you leaned into it? Where has fear been a signal to you to lean into it, to trigger some growth inside of you? Let me give you an example from my life. When I was about a year sober, that's when I decided to make a major life change. They'd always told me in Alcoholics Anonymous not to make a major life change in the first year of sobriety. And so what I took that to mean was make a major life change once you hit a year of sobriety, right? So having heard that, I decided that I wanted to become an Ironman triathlete. Have I told you about this yet? I think I might have. But, all jokes aside, when I went through that process, there was a lot that I found that I was going to be afraid of. For one, I was afraid of swimming in the open water. I was just afraid of getting into the open water and swimming past a buoy, let alone 2.4 miles in the open ocean. So I had to learn really quick on how to do that. I had to not just face that fear, but I had to move past it. And I found pretty quickly that when I just tried to jump into the open water and swim, what I found was that I would have panic attacks, the likes that I hadn't seen since college, when I had experienced those panic attacks. So I got out and I realized, how can I rise above this fear? How can I look at this as a signal to push past my comfort zone? And I realized that the fear was telling me that maybe I wasn't ready yet to go out that far, but that there was a level beyond that, or that there was a level before that where I could push past my comfort zone and still experience some significant growth. That fear was a signal to me that this was something I wanted to achieve. I wanted to get in the open water and get over this fear, but I had to do it methodically. And so I had to work my way backward from swimming in the open water to what was the very next step that I could take that, gave me that sense of discomfort, but it didn't overwhelm me with panic. And that next step for me was simply floating in the pool. I had to learn to float in the pool before I could get into the open water. And after I learned to float in the pool and I got over that and I rose above that fear, I swam 25 yards in the pool. And I rose above that fear. I got comfortable with that. I grew progressively through the process. And I swam 50 yards, and then I swam 100 yards. Then I started swimming parallel to shore in the ocean. Then finally I swam to the buoy. And I did that progressively so that I put myself about 5% beyond my comfort zone. That was the process of rising above fear to experience greater flow. I was turning myself into a hero. And that hero archetype simply doesn't do massive leaps beyond his comfort zone or her comfort zone to achieve these great things right away. They achieve those remarkable things one step at a time, one small step at a time. And, a year later, over the course of that year, I'd swam in the open water many more times, and I'd increased the distance so that a year later, after I first started floating in the pool and had my first panic attacks in the open water, I pushed past my fears enough. I expanded my comfort zone enough so that I swam the 2.4 miles comfortably in an Ironman competition. And I rose above that fear. And that's simply to say that we can all do that. We can all have this choice on which archetype we want to live in. We can choose to be, with our fears, we can choose to be the victim. We could choose to remain a victim of our fears, suppressed by them, so that we're constantly fighting against them and losing this losing battle of giving into our fear and allowing it to run our lives, so that we're leaning into bad behaviors and constantly being a victim and constantly asking, why me? We can become the soldier. We could learn to face our fears and rise up to the level to face them and acknowledge them for what they are, that they're part of the human experience, and that it's okay to feel that, and that we're not going to let it suppress our lives, but we're going to continue to live with these fears, but we're going to keep peace with them. Or we could choose the most exciting option, the option of growth. We could choose the archetype of hero, where we see the fears as part of the human experience, but we also see it as a signal that we are pushing up to our comfort zone, that we are ready to grow, and we use it as an opportunity to grow. Yes, fear can be an important signal that danger is nearby, that yes, we don't want to run into a fire because it makes us afraid. Of course, we don't want to do that. That's an appropriate fear to have. But with fears could also be a signal that we're being challenged to bring more out of ourselves. So if you're seeing that in your world, if you're feeling afraid, if you're feeling a constant sense of fear, what is the signal that it's giving to you? Can you rise above the level you're at now to continue your growth trajectory by becoming a hero? Thanks for joining me this time. We'll see you the next time. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Flow Over Fear podcast. If you'd like to learn more about getting into flow and learn the foundations of flow, I have a free video series on my website at www.adamcliffordhill.com called The Foundations of Flow. Feel free to go there and download it and start your journey to rising above fear and achieving greater flow in your life. And if you like this episode, and I'm guessing you did if you stuck around for this long, then please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button, and you will receive notifications when I have new interviews, new recaps, and new trainings that pop up on YouTube. Thanks again for joining us.